This is the DotKids Child Online Safety, really a conversation with the APrIGF community, as well as all those who are joining us online. We really are looking at the newly launched DotKids. It really is an internet space, kind of kids is really for all things kids. And I really want to make sure people understand, why are we talking about this? Why are we so concerned? How we should be concerned? And what are the framing and guiding principles underpinning the space? And we'll be hearing from our esteemed guests who will be speaking to you a little bit later as well. And then we'll be opening the floor to the audience in our room as well as online for any questions you have, any suggestions you have. We really want to hear from you. Any questions you have about, creating a safe space for children online, as well as anything you might hear from our speakers. So maybe just a quick introduction to what DotKids is. Does anybody know what a top-level domain is? Anybody in the audience? Nobody in the audience knows what it is. Why are we here at IGF? Why are we here at APrIGF when we don't know what that is? So to the right of the dot, the top level domain, like .com, .org, .net, .asia, and .kids. And why is it so important for .kids to have more protection and more stringent policies looking at content? Because this is an internet space that we are hoping it is for children, by children, and it needs to be a safe space for them to explore, to learn, to grow without being exposed to some more unsavory content on the internet that probably is in other namespaces, in other places, other platforms as well. So that is really what underlies DotKids. I don't think the clicker is working, so next, please. So really talking about the mission and vision, really we are trying to create and foster an online space with kids' best interests at heart and to be a sustainable source of support to children's rights and welfare initiatives, especially related to internet and digital rights. Does anybody know what the definition of children might be? Anybody know it all here? Okay, so for DotKids, we are really basing a lot of our guidelines. Next, please. Under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And in this convention, which is the most signed signatory instrument for us in the world, it defines children as those under 18. And for the kids' guiding principles, we take a lot of it from this document. And you can see here, there's 4 particular bullets that we want to concentrate on. It is the children's right to protection, children's right to privacy, children's right to survival, and children's right to freedom of expression. To give you a little bit of idea what the very first one means, because it seems quite broad, it is protection from unsavory content, from things that are illegal, from gambling, from tobacco, from, things that are not age appropriate for children. And if we're looking at the right to privacy, the second bullet point there is, we've been talking a lot about data privacy, right to privacy in general at APrIGF. Children too have a right to privacy. The third one, the children's right to survival. This would be content, that the right to not have to see content that would promote the taking of life, of suicide, and so on. And of course, the last one is quite self-explanatory. The right to the freedom of expression, that they're able to post what they are thinking, learn, grow, and explore. Next one. And also, besides, trying to be prohibitive of things, we also want to encourage content that is kids-friendly, children-friendly, to grow on this particular internet namespace. And there's a kids-friendly content guide that we require registrants, those who take by these domains, to adhere to. And it is non-discrimination, it is marketing and advertising, especially in relation to children. We have to be particularly sensitive that it is not exploiting them, that we're not trying to push any kind of unsavory or inappropriate materials or inappropriate services to children. It is content categorization. For kids, you know, there's a sliding range when we're talking about, you know, a child could be anywhere from, you know, 0, of course, all the way to 18. And the appropriateness of content really does change as the child ages. And then when we go to security, policy development, and children participation, this is really talking about the policies that govern this namespace. We have partnered for over 10 years with a lot of child rights organizations and initiatives and welfare initiatives to look at what really is best for children in terms of protection, but as well as allowing them the freedom to express themselves, which brings me to the point where we look at children participation. I think you've heard a lot about representation in this APrIGF. So we want to hear from children themselves what they want to see in the namespace. We don't want to be too prescriptive, and we want to allow them the freedom to be able to express themselves on this namespace. And then finally, multi-stakeholder participation and collaboration. All of you here in the room in Singapore as well as online, you are part of our multi-stakeholder. It's not only children, it's not only technical community, it's not only child rights welfare organizations, but also all of you. You are part of the multi-stakeholder collaborative efforts, and we really want to hear from you what you think. I don't want to waste too much time on these, you know, quite serious bullets here. We really want to hear also from our guests. Maybe next slide. I'd like to introduce to you our guest speakers who are next to me in the room. First, right next to me, we have Jessie Lee. She is from Meta, and she's a public policy manager on content regulation. She is based here in Singapore. Online, we have Jutta Croll, and she is a chairwoman and project manager for Stiftung Digitale Chancen, and she is based in Germany. Thank you, Jutta, for joining us online. I know it's very early for you in Germany, so thank you for you participating with us as well. And then finally, next to Jessie, we have Stella To. She is our youth delegate, and maybe you've heard her speak already in APrIGF. She is part of NetMission.Asia, and she's also affiliated with ISOC Malaysia. So I really want to ask Jessie about what it is for Meta. What are the important things that we need to look out for? How is the content policy and content regulation, especially in terms of content targeted at children, how is that governed? How is the framework, and also, you know, is there any kind of difficulties when you're looking at this with takedowns, and also the policies that govern this? Jessie.
Testing. Okay, it works. Testing. Thank you, Jennifer. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you. I'm Jessie, and I work on the safety policy team here at Meta. And issues that we look after include child safety, women's safety, human exploitation, suicide and self-injury, a whole bunch of, you know, unsavory online content that we don't want our children to be exposed to. And I think I would start with just giving a broad overall frame of the different issues or different buckets that we think about when we talk about online safety related to children. So I think for me, this manifests in 3 key ways. One, of course, from the types of content that children are exposed to online. And 2, from the types of content that they are creating online, which could then put them at danger. And 3, in terms of the people that they're interacting with on our platforms that could be potentially dangerous or inappropriate. And of course, these 3 buckets are not mutually exclusive, and they could mutually reinforce each other. You know, if you look at a lot of bad content, that could then influence you to produce bad content, and then that could lead bad actors to look for you. So I think it's a very complex interplay of factors. And here at Meta, we use a combination of our policies, our product tools and features, and also programs and resources to ensure that all these different aspects of safety are looked looked after. And our community standards that I would start talking about is essentially the set of policies that we have that govern what content is and is not allowed on our platforms. And this applies to all of our users as a baseline, including children. So things that are prohibited on the platform includes content related to child sexual exploitation, the worst of the worst, and also nudity-related content, adult sexual exploitation, bullying and harassment, hate speech, so on and so forth. And on top of our baseline community standards, we then go a step further to restrict certain types of content that could be okay for the general public, but we do not want children below the age of 18 to see. And examples of this could be violent and graphic content, because we know that children could not be developmentally ready to deal with this content, and also with overt sexualized content, for example. Suicide and self-injury related content are all what we consider as a group of mature themes that we might not want our children to be exposed to. And so traditionally, prohibition and restriction are what we think about. But as we move into the future, we also think about recommendation. So that will be the next trench of what we are interested to look at. And for this, what I really talk about is, while there are content that could be okay on the platform, if we are recommending it by our algorithms, we are pushing it directly to the user without them indicating that they want to see it, then we need to have an even stricter set of policies in place in terms of thinking, is this some type of content that I want to actively recommend to users? And this is what we consider as borderline content. And one example that I can give to the group here is in terms of eating disorders content. And this is one group of content that is, very dangerous for youth to be actively exposed to, especially in large amounts, because when, children are growing up, they struggle with body image issues, and being overtly exposed or recommended to this type of content is something that we want to avoid on our platforms. And so I think that's on the policy side of the house, and I can also give an example of how we think about our product design, making it safer for children from the get-go. And so I think when we design our products and features, we think about it with children in mind in terms of age-appropriate design, and how can we protect them from the first place. So we have introduced privacy by default settings for young people on our platforms. And so today, if you are the youth signing up for a new account on Instagram, for example, and if you are below the age of 16, your account will be automatically set to private by default. And this then offers you an additional layer of protection in terms of the content that you're creating, putting out there. Maybe only a close circle of friends are able to see it. And also having a private account would then protect you from being approached by other bad actors that might, have bad intentions. And lastly, in terms of interactions, just to touch very quickly on that, we also put in place friction to prevent bad actors from looking for young people on the platform. So we look at signals. For example, if you have had other minor children accounts report you for inappropriate behavior, then we might put an additional layer of friction to prevent you from reaching other children on the platform. So these are all examples of how Meta is taking a comprehensive multi-pillar approach to children's online safety.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you, Jessie, for the very comprehensive summary of what Meta is doing. I am mindful of the time, and I'm mindful, of course, time from Jutta, who has joined us from Germany. Jutta, can you tell us a little bit more about, probably the situation in Europe as well as probably globally, and your work that you are doing with children's rights, children's digital rights. Thank you, Jutta.
Yes, of course, I'm happy to do so. So as you see from my background, I'm working for an organization that is advocating children's rights, and especially in the digital environment. Things that we are doing are now that we have the General Comment number 25 to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, on children's rights in relation to the digital environment. We base everything on that. And as you may know, the General Comment was published by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child last year in March, I think. And it requires a lot of the states that have ratified the UNCRC, especially in regard of protecting children, but also in regard of ensuring their rights to freedom of expression, for example, as you have said before. We think that what the General Comment says in regard of creating safe spaces for children It's an obligation for the states to create the frameworks for safe spaces for children, but also an obligation for the platform providers, as we have heard before from Jessie and from Meta. But how can we do that? It's not an easy task. It's very complex because the risks that may come along for children when being in the digital environment are huge. We are talking about abuse of children, about child sexual abuse material spread on the internet. We are talking about grooming. All these risks are definitely there, and so it's necessary to create such safe spaces. We do think that DotKids provides for a unique opportunity to create a safe space for children, of course, and children will be attracted to any service that is on DotKids, of course, any platform that they will find there. But we need to be aware that also if we create such a playground, it's like in real world, a playground will also attract potential perpetrators to children, and we need to ensure that the space is still kept safe for children. So that means we need respective safeguards that make sure that children have the appropriate content in this safe space, and that they are protected from inappropriate content, and especially from inappropriate interaction with people that might be perpetrators to them. What we need to be aware of is that any restriction we put on a safe space and to children's access to communication and access to information, access to other users, that will also have an impact on their rights to freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. So we need a balanced approach. And that is also the main discussion that we have right now, as we have asked for Europe. In Europe, with the new EU regulation, the draft regulation that is underway, the big discussion is whether we can ensure that, on the one hand, all these rights to freedom of expression of all users, the right to privacy of all users, can be balanced with the right to protection for children. Thank you.
Thank you, Jutta, for the comprehensive look at Europe as well as globally on what is being done. It is always a fine balance to see appropriate safeguards and protection, as well as upholding the children's right to freedom of expression, and of course using the internet in a way that benefits their potential and growth. I want to swing back to Asia a little bit and also talk to our Gen Z participants. So we're going to come to Stella. Stella, what is online safety to you, especially your generation who are digital natives? What is that to you? What do you hope to see in this space?
All right. Thank you, Jennifer. Sorry for that. So I believe that for Gen Z, the reason why that we were included in this dialogue, which we appreciate, is because we are kind of in the transition phase. We're transitioning out of being acknowledged as children and moving on to perhaps bigger responsibilities. And when it comes to our relation as to why there's perhaps a new perspective, is because we are more aware of some things that we want to explore. We're also given more freedom in a sense. And some parents may also feel like once you reach a certain age, they do feel like the responsibility is now passed on to the individual as individual youth, as opposed to how they feel about children. I'd like to also just comment on some things that I've seen in the process of preparing for the workshop proposal, which we also helped work with to bring it to IGF 2022 this year, is that for DotKids, I do note that it is allowed for parents to register under DotKids. And so something that we have seen, Gen Z, is that there has been a kind of prevalence in cases where parents are using their kids for clout. So they're using their kids to kind of stay relevant in a way. And I do believe that this needs to be discussed, because safeguards for this should be something that DotKids might want to consider, especially since you'll be acknowledging and giving them that. Another thing I'd also like to highlight is that Meta also, Jessie mentioned earlier about looking at policies kind of in a general sense, but I do want to highlight that cultural differences across the world can result in different ways the parent and child relationship is perceived. So I would highlight that in Asia, parent and child relationship may be considered more one way, and it could result in issues of trying to get effective communication. So Jennifer also mentioned earlier, we want to see representation of children in this multi-stakeholder dialogue, but it may be hard to see this kind of happen, and I'd like to hear perspectives on how you believe that you can ensure the localization so it's relevant to the culture and context of that particular country, as well as representation of the children.
Thank you. Thank you, Stella. That is actually very important for us in Asia-Pacific region. There's a lot of cultural sensitivities and differences, even within our own region. There's a lot of, I guess, tradition, as well as things that I've learned from, previous generations, that it is still quite difficult for young people, and especially children, to really speak up and speak their mind. And we really hope this is an opportunity for them to be able to express themselves freely. I do want to open the floor now, actually, to Q&A. I know we only have half an hour. I want to reserve at least a third of the time to hear from people in the room and also online. So online participants, we haven't forgotten about you. If you have comments or questions, please put it in the chat or raise your hand, use your raise hand icon. And people in the room, please feel free to also come up to the mic and, ask your questions, because this is something that we should all be concerned about, because children are vulnerable, but we still want to give them the freedom and space to be able to use the internet in a way that benefits their growth. Anybody from the audience? I promise you that there will be prizes for people who actually come and ask. I see one that is coming up.
Hello, I'm Jaewon from Korea, and I have a question that, in some specific countries, I feel like it is being censored to say what you want to say and then how you use the internet. And because it's a government regulation, there's nothing much that I felt like they can try to change it unless they go out of the country. So for this measure, how do you think we can try to help them having a freedom of using the internet as they are? Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Jaewon. Is that a question you wanted to direct specifically to anybody in the panel or just in general?
Okay, I can give a stab at it first. So I think government regulation is one of those iron hammer things where, even us as a business, we have to comply with. Otherwise, it's you don't comply and you're out of the country kind of thing. But I think the approach that we try to take here at Meta in terms of helping and informing regulators on what is the ideal way that they can go about thinking about regulation is in terms of engaging them from the very start of policy development. And sometimes regulators do actively reach out to us because they might not be fully aware of all the difficulties and challenges that's involved with online content regulation. And by educating them from the very beginning on the watch-outs that they have, on the international guidelines, principles that we should watch out and keep in mind when they are making their regulation, I think this helps us to land in a much better place eventually when the actual regulation or the law is passed.
Thank you, Jess. Thank you, Jessie. Jutta, did you want to add to it?
Yes, I think it's a very difficult question. As you said before, we also have to take into account the cultural differences in the various regions of the world and also in the various countries. Of course, we know that in many countries, these repressive actions are undertaken by governments and by states. And so freedom of expression is not guaranteed, not only for young people, but for the population at large. On the other hand, in some cases, we need some restrictions to be able to cope with hate speech, with fake information, and also with child sexual abuse material that should not be spread across the internet. So it's a very difficult thing to find the balance, not to be restrictive to freedom of expression, but still to keep under control all this unwanted content and this unhealthy content on the internet.
Thank you, Jutta. Yes, always the question and the consideration of balancing well. I think there was a question from the floor. Yes, Gaia?
Yeah. Sorry, I had perhaps a similar question, but how do you deal with striking the balance between sexual exploration or sexual health information that children today want to access versus kind of sanitizing the environment, perhaps taking it too far? So how do you go about, where does your understanding lie around that?
Thank you, Gaia, for the question. This is always a really good question because we want to protect them, but we also want to educate them. And I think, at least I can speak at least from the DotKids Foundation point of view, we do have categories of materials that are completely prohibited, but there are certain categories where if it is in an educational material sense, right? If we're in school, there is of course sex ed, and there is also, you know, history lessons. When in history you learn a lot about very violent wars and things that are quite horrific in human history. So if it is in an appropriate educational context, I think this is something that is beneficial for the growth of children, as well as, you know, on a sliding scale as well. What is appropriate for somebody, a child at 5 may not be, you know, if you're a child at 15, you know, that sliding scale goes back up, and the information given to a child at 15 would be different. Hopefully that is helpful. I don't know if anybody wants to add to this. Yes, Jutta.
Yes, I do think that especially at that point, we, of course, with the huge amount of content, we rely on artificial intelligence and algorithms to define what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. But still, we need to improve in this matter, because the grade between the unhealthy content and the content necessary to keep the health of young people is very small. So I do think we need to train the algorithms better. We need to train artificial intelligence better to decide whether it's the one category or the other category. And then in the end, in some cases, we still need a human making the decision whether the content is provided to young people or whether it should not be provided to young people.
Thank you, Jutta. Thank you for bringing up a really important point of AI assisting with combating this content, as well as, of course, the human element, where we also have to see if the AI is correct or not. I see there's more hands up on the floor. If you can actually stand up right behind the mic, I can see who is first and second. Please go ahead.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm James from the Philippines. I would like to ask, what are the safety nets of your initiatives pertaining to the security and privacy for the children, especially they are using the digital space, knowing that what they see, they do?
Thank you, James. I'll take the last question, and then, because we're running out of time, and then we'll try to answer all of it at once.
Okay, thank you for the wonderful presentation. I'm Kaushalya Gupta. I'm from the World Wide Web Foundation, usually from India. My question is to Jessie. I'm really glad that you mentioned age-appropriate design, because most of the conversations usually focus on content and not design aspects. And we've seen that, like, terms and conditions kind of like are not very accessible to young people, especially children. And so I just want to know, what are the ways in which we could actually make them more readable, understandable, because often we find that terms and conditions lead to shady data harvesting without kids knowing. So my question is for everyone, but like, thanks for mentioning that.
So thank you for the question. I haven't forgotten prizes, by the way. Those who have spoken up, please come to me after this session. I will answer quite briefly because we only have 1.5 minutes left. The question about, what are the policies, security and privacy for DotKids namespace? I mean, I'm going to do a small plug here. Go to DotKids, DOT.KIDS. There you will find a very comprehensive set of registry policies that govern the internet namespace. I assure you there is very stringent implementation of this, even more so than regular top-level domains. So of course CSAM is a completely prohibited category of content, and there are other contents which I have talked about a little earlier in the presentation that we do look out for, we do ban, and we do take down when we see this category of content. I'm going to pass the time over to Jessie to answer the last question.
Super quick answer from me. So we do try to make all these materials, including terms of use, safety features, community guidelines, whatever, etc., more sexy and more digestible in a short format for younger audiences. And so this might be in the form of either creating short form digital videos or images assets ourselves, or we might collaborate with some of the popular creators who are out there who have a wider reach among youth, and then see what creative ideas they can then come up with to sort of share their own experiences and to help educate our audiences on our policies and features.
Thank you so much, Jessie, and thank you, Jutta, for joining us from Germany. Thank you, Stella, for being with us as well. Thank you for all your great questions. I know we're running out of time, but those who have put up your hand and come up to the questions, come up to me to the stage after this session for your little prize. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, and bye-bye.
Lorraine, could you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Are you able
to check your video, audio?
Yes. Are you able to hear me?
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thanks, Jen. That was a fantastic session. Unfortunately, we don't have return gifts, but maybe the people who ask questions in our session can also go up to Jen, and I'm sure she'll be generous enough. Before we get started on our session, I wanted to congratulate this room because you have the privilege of not just witnessing one all-woman panel, but you'll actually have two going one after the other. So I think that's a fantastic moment for APrIGF because we've really prioritized gender diversity and privileging women's voices at the APrIGF. Before I go any further, I'm Gaia. I'm with the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. The Resource Center and Access Now is extremely proud to present this panel because we've been wanting to have this conversation at APrIGF for a long time. Today, we'll be, over the next 30 minutes or perhaps a little lesser, we'll be talking about a very interesting intersection, a topic that has never been explored at APrIGF before, which is the responsibility of investors and how we can integrate investing and looking at investors as part of our community and expand the frontiers of internet governance through a more inclusive approach. This is also extremely special for us because Singapore is really the financial hub of Asia. Most investors are situated here, so it's also timely that we were able to have this conversation while we are here at Singapore. And the panel today that we have, we could not possibly think of better people to get this conversation started with us because Access Now, in collaboration with the Resource Center and Heartland Initiative and multiple other partners, we were able to come up with a guide called Navigating the Surveillance Technology Ecosystem, a human rights due diligence guide for investors. And Lorraine, of course, has extensive experience, and I'll just in a minute introduce the panel. But before I go on to introducing the panel, I wanted to ask you a question. How many people in the room have investments in the tech sector? How many of us have put money into the tech sector? I have a little bit, a shamefully small amount, but I have a small. So there are few people here who have investments in tech. How many people have interacted with investors? Yeah. I hope it was a good interaction. So that's also indicative of this being a topic that needs to be introduced into the APrIGF space. And I think there's a lot that we could get out of that. To help us with that, we have Dhevy, Sivaprakasam, who's the Asia Pacific Counsel with Access Now. And we have Lorraine Howe, who's an ESG analyst on responsible investments with Columbia Threadneedle Investing. Both of them have extensive experience in the topics that they're going to talk about. What we would do is start with Dhevy and address the question of what is this guide and why did we decide to come up with this guide, and what is it that we try to achieve with it? And then we'll go to Lorraine to get a more specific investor's perspective. Just to let you know, there might be investors who are joining us as well over the course of the next few minutes. So if you're able to stay back, we should be able to have a conversation with them. Over to you, Dhevy. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, thanks a lot, Gaia. So as she's mentioned, my name is Dhevy. I'm Asia Pacific Policy Counsel for Access Now. And jumping straight into the guide, like why did we do this? So one thing we realized that the ICT sector and technologies are all part of our lives, and this is something that, you know, this entire conference is based on, so we won't belabor that point, but specifically on surveillance technologies, you know, we've seen the expansion of it because of relatively low cost, broad accessibility, and lack of regulation in this sector. And so we wanted to do a guide that would specifically give not just investors, but civil society and also governments a kind of guidance for how to look at human rights due diligence before you invest in technologies, including in the surveillance tech ecosystem, not just in surveillance tech, but also generally in the tech system. So it's in this context that BHRRC, Heartland Initiative, and Access Now, we created the Surveillance Technologies Accountability Project, STEP, which worked with Agentura.ru, the Gulf Center for Human Rights, Paradigm Initiative, and R3D over 2 years to conduct workshops and also interviews to find out as much as we could, including desk research, to culminate in a guide specifically for investors. The guide essentially is how do you conduct like human rights due diligence when you're purchasing or holding shares in companies, especially the ones that have activities or investments in the surveillance tech ecosystem. First, what kind of surveillance does the guide look at? Two kinds. So one is targeted surveillance, which is spyware on individuals that is either used covertly or overtly, and the other is mass surveillance, which includes stuff like biometric recognition software, DPI, IMSI capture devices, which collects like information across a broad population and also indefinitely. And which companies does this guide specifically look at? So those are the ones that exclusively produce or sell surveillance technologies like NSO Group or Gamma. Those that sell goods and services that include but are not limited to surveillance tech like Alphabet and Amazon, sorry, I've got a script. And those that produce goods and services that can be used for both surveillance and non-surveillance purposes like Sandvine. So the starting point is to acknowledge that when these technologies are abused, the human rights risks that come from them actually then translate to other material risks like legal risks, operational risks, reputational risks, and financial risks. So, for example, in the case of NSO Group, when the Pegasus revelations came out that more than 45 countries were implicated in buying Pegasus spyware and using it against individuals within the country, including heads of state and also journalists, human rights defenders, civil society. It translated to many different risks for NSO, one being litigation that was filed by WhatsApp and Apple against NSO, which resulted in financial risk. So there's excessive legal fees and paying damages and limiting the company's operations. You have reputational risk because the CEO stepped down and there was a significant proportion of staff who were let go. And then you have legal and operational risk because NSO was blacklisted by the US government and there's an ongoing EU inquiry into Pegasus. And so these are the very real material risks that the company then faces that then also not only directly impacts on investors, but also indirectly exposes investors if you have asset managers investing in surveillance tech companies within your portfolio. So, for example, Blackstone Group had invested in Sandvine, but through a private equity firm, Francisco Partners. And when Sandvine was implicated of providing DPI tech to repressive governments, then Blackstone Group as an investor had to respond also to criticism. So for investors, this guide provides a list of questions for you to look more broadly into how would you ensure that your investments are human rights centered. And they're grounded in the human rights responsibilities under the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. So it can be used beyond just the surveillance tech industry to the tech industry in general. And also noting here that sometimes companies don't call themselves surveillance technology companies, but they could be producing products that amount to having surveillance capacities on the ground. And these questions in the guide, they cover three main areas. So one is the governance, policy, and practice angle. And then it looks at the product life cycle and also remedy. So go into one of them. Each one actually has a whole list of questions that are in the guide, but I'll just look more broadly at the broader questions. So on governance, policy, and practice, the first thing to ask is, does the company have a public human rights policy? And do the board and senior management, they actively monitor human rights risks? And this is something investors should be, constantly actually engaging with the company on. On the product life cycle, there are three stages. So one is on design. And specifically on design, the questions to ask actually, it's what is the intended use of the technology and are there safeguards in place? Can you shut down a technology if there's abuse? And then you move on to the sale and deployment stage of the life cycle, which is what percentage of the company's revenue or product are in surveillance technologies? Who are they selling to? Are these countries in conflict zones? Are they sanctioned countries? And do these countries have a documented history of violating human rights? Are they selling to law enforcement agencies, military, defense contractors? And then you move to licensing. So does the company have human rights criteria when it tenders, when it evaluates the tenders that comes to them? And also contractual provisions in sales contracts where you allow for the revocation of a license if there's abuse of human rights. So this is just a broad summary. Oh, sorry. And then the remedy process is the third one. It's very important. So that's the last, but it's also a really important section of the guide, which looks into when there are violations that are done. Is there publicly available and safe mechanism in line with the guiding principles, which then provides for remedy that can be offered by the company for the violations? I'll stop there because that's just a brief summary.
Thank you, Dhevy. In fact, when we were discussing or when we were looking at inputs for the guide, one of the things that we focused on is making sure that this guide works for investors, but it also works for the technical community, for civil society to use as a map to ask questions or to provide support to investors. And what's really interesting about that is that we're hoping that we can take this guide and now work with civil society, work with academia, work with different actors to engage investors and the private sector. Let's move to Lorraine. And Lorraine, I just wanted to quickly note that investors are such a critical part of the private sector ecosystem, and not just the private sector ecosystem. They're such a critical part of the digital ecosystem, making innovation possible, making the kind of tech we experience today possible, right? When we take that and couple it with the fact that there are legislation coming up in the EU that is mandating due diligence from different parts of the private sector, including the investors, all the way to Japan, where there's a guidelines that is being developed now requiring investors to do human rights and environmental due diligence. How do we take that trust, use the UNGPs, and work with investors? Because what we'd really like to hear from you is that, quite frankly, investors are not all the same size, shape, and form, right? They're quite different. Why would investors care about human rights or human rights due diligence? What's been your experience as a member of this community, given your extensive experience?
Yeah, brilliant. I'll just share my screen if that's okay. Are you able to see my screen?
It's coming up, yes.
Brilliant. Yes, does that work? Are you able to see?
Yes, we can see.
Oh, brilliant. Great. So thank you so much, Gaia, for inviting me to speak at this session on assessing investments in surveillance and technology, and also to the Asia Pacific Regional Internet Governance Forum for hosting this event. I'm really excited to be here and to be able to give the investor perspective on sort of why human rights is an important issue and how we at Columbia Threadneedle Investments look at integrating human rights in the investment decision-making process and sort of the challenges we face. So just to give a bit of background, my name is Lorraine Howe, and I'm an ESG analyst in the responsible investment team at Columbia Threadneedle Investments. And we're a global asset manager managing around £531 billion in assets under management. And we also offer a third-party service for clients where we engage and vote on behalf of a further 53 investment institutions representing around £848 billion in assets. My primary focus is on conducting research and engagements with companies in the tech sector. So I just wanted to give a bit of the background to the vast spectrum of the responsible investment ecosystems and sort of how different organizations fit together. So in this landscape, we as asset managers, we draw upon different types and sources of information to help us inform our research and engagements with companies. So you can see on this slide here, this ranges from, the reporting frameworks to the rating agencies and really helpful NGO resources, especially like the guides mentioned in Dhevyy's speech earlier around navigating the surveillance technology ecosystem. And moving on to why it's an important issue for responsible investors. So you can see that this forms one of our key ESG engagement themes. And apart from the obvious sort of ethical reasons of why investors and people should care about human rights, as Dhevy mentioned, it's a financially material risk for companies and investors. So essentially the mismanagement of this risk will impact a company's bottom lines, i.e. its profits. And Dhevy already gave some really good examples, but poor management of human rights can lead to financial risks, as human rights violations can lead to litigations and fines and, increased cost of capital and borrowing. And she already gave a really good example. And then in terms of business risk, because investigations can disrupt companies' business operations, for example, stoppages in production. And thirdly, reputational risk. We've seen stakeholders boycott companies as a result of their mismanagement of human rights. And I'm sure everyone remembers the Cambridge Analytica scandal that sort of dealt that severe blow to Facebook's reputation on privacy. And lastly, as well as Guy mentioned on the regulatory side, so we've seen greater regulatory pressure both on companies and investors. And in Europe, we now have the draft of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, as well as the Sustainable Financial Disclosure Regulation as well. So you can see that there's sort of both top-down pressure from regulation, but also bottom-up pressure as our clients, so asset owners, pension funds, charity endowments, they are becoming more conscious regarding the impact of their investments as well. So I just wanted to speak a bit more about sort of how we integrate human rights in this process. So there are three main ways in which our stewardship team integrates human rights, and this is through screening, engagement, and voting. And I'll just touch briefly on screening. So for our responsible investment strategies, we have certain conduct-based criteria that companies have to meet before being included in these funds. And this is all publicly available on our website, but some of the human rights criteria includes, for example, excluding companies that infringe on international human rights standards. And moving on to engagement. So as an active ownership team, we engage with our portfolio companies to affect change. And we do this by speaking with management, sustainability teams, and investor relation teams to understand how they're managing their ESG risks. We suggest areas for improvement, and we share best practices from other companies and from other NGO resources and other resources we have available. And this is the sort of methodology we have in our engagement approach, which is consisting of 3 pillars. And I'll just quickly run through these. So priority companies, these are those with the biggest holdings and the highest ESG risks. So they typically warrant a higher number of interactions per year. We have thematic projects. So these are companies that are identified through a thematic lens. And this year we have 3 projects focused on human rights. So human and indigenous rights in the energy and materials sector, mandatory human rights due diligence across all sectors, and also mitigation of social harms through social audits. And lastly, we also have event-driven engagement, and this typically includes dialogues with companies before their meetings to outline our investor expectations and positionings regarding their proxy, as well as addressing any controversies or scandals that we've found. And as part of these 3 pillars, we've engaged a variety of technology companies on human rights issues, from disclosing human rights policies and practices, conducting due diligence, and how companies take appropriate steps to remedy any violations. And another dimension to engagements is collaborative engagements with other investors. And this is really helpful to allow us to pull together our resources, align on our engagement objectives, and put greater investor pressure on companies. So this is where the civil society and NGO space plays a really important part, because we need the subject matter experts to help build up our own technical knowledge to have more fruitful conversations with companies. And on this slide, you can just see a sample of some of the collaborations that we're involved in. And it's also a helpful way for us to escalate our engagement process as well when our own individual engagements with companies are lacking in progress. And another way for investors to escalate the engagement process is by using our shareholder vote. This is also known as proxy voting. And in our public corporate governance guidelines, we're transparent around our standards, as well as the vote outcome transparency. So we've made our vote and our vote rationale public 24 hours after the vote for many years. But during these annual general meetings, investors can vote on issues that have been brought forward by management and shareholders. And shareholders typically file shareholder resolutions with companies when engagement on a specific issue isn't generating enough change or improvement. So it's a public way for them to signal some dissatisfaction. And recently, we've seen a lot more proposals on environmental and social issues. I think almost half of the shareholder proposals in 22 were focused on the social aspect, including human rights and also human capital. So you see that's the increased investor interest on the topic of human rights. And lastly, as a last resort, investors are able to divest their holdings. And this is typically when consistent engagement or even lack of engagement yields little results, and investors consider the company too high of a risk to hold. And I just wanted to touch on the challenges before wrapping up. So one of which we've seen is getting companies to commit to human rights due diligence, as it's not widely understood what human rights due diligence means. And another is around the transparency of the assessment. So some are partially or fully confidential, and this prevents us as stakeholders from understanding the results of the assessment, like the salient risk and how the company is addressing them. And we've also seen remediation is difficult in practice because levels of social protections are available in various regions differ, so it can be very difficult. So just to summarize, it's definitely an important issue given it does have that financial impact, and the tools like Dhevy mentioned in terms of the guides that the NGO and civil society are incredibly helpful when it's practical in terms of the engagement questions and also the defining the materiality and how that impacts the company. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorraine. I'm going to open up the floor, and if you have questions or comments, please just raise your hand or come forward. But I have a very quick question for Lorraine and a question for Dhevy while we wait for others. Lorraine, one of the common sort of perceptions is that caring about rights or requiring rights compliant practices will always come at the cost of profits. Is that sort of a shared understanding that that if you want to go for ethical investing, it will yield you lower profits?
That's definitely not the case from sort of our perspective, given we do think that human rights and the poor management of human rights does have that financially material impact. And I think what's been important when we're speaking to companies is being able to frame the conversation around how human rights issues will impact their business, whether that's financially, through their business, or reputationally, and being able to link the issue to the financial materiality. I think it's easier to have that conversation with companies, and we as investors see it that way as well, especially given that we commit to abiding by the UN Guiding Principles on human rights as well. And we've seen many cases in terms of the reputational damages, human rights violations, and how that impacts investments as well.
Thank you, Lorraine. A quick question to Dhevy, and then we have a question on chat, and we'll go to that. So Dhevy, when we work with civil society, one of the often repeated frustrations we hear from national organizations, especially when they try to talk to tech companies, is getting a response that's really a non-response, in a sense that you don't really find solutions sometimes through engaging with companies. Not many grassroots, national, even regional organizations engage investors. What do you think might be the reason? Because once you've gone up to the CEO of a company or the head of public policy of a company and you're not able to get the solution you want, investors are an extremely interesting next frontier because, in a sense, they're the boss of the boss, right?
Yeah, no, you can hear me. Yeah. I completely agree there. I think on why local groups and regional groups don't engage so much with investors, I think it's just a case of two worlds that don't meet that often. And actually investors are a very good partner for civil society, because what we've observed in civil society, especially at Access Now, is that investors come to us with the same questions actually as to how to get companies to respond sincerely and regularly on human rights risk concerns on the ground, because that impacts their portfolios as well. And so we see here where civil society can actually give investors a clear sort of background, and also just from their experiences, the real risks on the ground that will then translate to these investors. And there is a very key partnership there that we need to build, and this is part of also, the guide is part of that engagement. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. There's a question, Lorraine, from the chat, and maybe Dhevy, you could chime in as well. Especially when it comes to the surveillance industry, what we notice is the technology being developed in the West and sort of being exported to countries in the Southeast, having significant impact. In fact, one of our colleagues during another panel mentioned Thailand as an example, where she said that Thailand doesn't produce surveillance technology, but imports it and deploys it, right? And increasingly, we are now seeing foreign policy requiring investors and companies to do due diligence. Have you received any kind of pressure to be more sensitive to surveillance technologies? What has been your experience with that?
So I can speak a bit more generally about how we engage with companies on their sort of customer due diligence approach, because I think a lot of companies, they have their export compliance programs, and that's sort of the minimum legal standard. But we go beyond that, and we kind of see and ask them how they're approaching their customer due diligence process in terms of what red flag indicators do they see when they're looking at their potential clients, and how is that escalated? What are the risks they see within that? So I think it's sort of delving a bit deeper into how they're approaching high risks exports to potentially high risk customers.
Thank you. We have a question. Yeah, please go ahead.
This is Jenna for the record. As we are living in a data-driven world, where AI could be the ways to eliminate bias and engender human rights, what do you think about algorithmic investment as one of the ways for responsible investment in the future? Our data is really powerful, but could it be used to benefit us who are creating it? Do you think building data sets that could eventually lead to an investment advantage and democratizing prosperity for all will be our future in the area when it comes to financial investment. Thank you.
Thanks, Shana. It's such an interesting question. Lorraine, do you have a response to that?
Sorry, I wasn't able to hear. Was it around the AI bias in data sets?
AI bias in data sets, but also about turning it around and using AI for good investing.
I see. I haven't experienced that personally, but I do see that as the future. I mean, we've seen the rise of artificial intelligence across all sectors, from the financial sector to the technology sector. And when we've been speaking to some of the companies, we're trying to understand what data sets they're using to try and prevent that type of bias that results in sort of gender or ethnic discrimination. But from the investing forefront, at the moment, we're not using any artificial intelligence, but I definitely could see that trajectory heading that way.
Thank you, Lorraine. I'm going to go to Dhevy for any concluding remarks and come back to you, Lorraine, if you had anything else to add, because we do have to wrap up.
I guess my concluding remark is also related to the question. I think if we start using AI also in investments, then we would, it's the key phrase that you hear everywhere, is multi-stakeholder approach. So involve everyone, involve civil society, engage with them, because they do observe things on the ground and are monitoring serious risks that are not possibly visible on the outside, and that would be important in decisions made by investors.
Lorraine, any closing words?
And I guess the key point is around sort of human oversight in terms of AI. Because of the bias, I don't think we can completely trust it at the moment without having that sort of the secondary or tertiary oversight from a human to actually make the final decision. And that's a key point when we're speaking to companies about AI in general, in terms of their governance processes, who's responsible, is there sufficient human oversight with the expertise to decide on whether to finally take the action from the algorithm.
Thank you, Lorraine, for joining us from London. Thank you for making the time to have this really important conversation. And I'm really glad you're the one who opens up this entire space for us at the APrIGF. I just wanted to thank everybody and Dhevy for helping us, not just with the guide, for having these conversations. And I guess I speak for both of us when I say that this guide and this work, we're just scratching the surface. There is so much to be done. There is just so much we could explore in terms of working with investors so that we can have shared prosperity, so that we can see better technology that works for all of us. And if any of you would like to get involved in this work, or if you'd like to adapt this guide, which, though the guide says surveillance technology, it could be applied to practically any kind of technology with a little bit of tweaking. And I'm sure we'll be happy to help you do that tweaking. So please keep us posted, and I look forward to more conversations at APrIGF and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Gaia. Thank you, Dhevy.